Hi everybody, welcome back to Left Foot Media. My name is Brendan Malone and I thought I would just make this short little video to quickly share my thoughts with you about the brand new Australian version of The Office, which is on Amazon Prime. And as far as I'm concerned, the Australian Office is already DOA. It's dead on arrival. I watched the entire series. I thought, well, I'll give it a chance. I saw the trailer and my first reaction was, yeesh, this ain't looking too flash. If I could borrow a moment from the great Michael Scott from The American Office to describe what I saw, but I thought, no, I don't want to be unfair on this. I'll give it a watch. And so I watched, thankfully, what are only about 20-minute long episodes. I watched the entire season. I had a bit of time and I subjected myself to it. And basically this thing, there were one or two moments where I've got to be honest, I chuckled. But generally speaking, it was just bland. I was watching a derivative imitation of something greater. But in this case, I look at it and I think, what are they doing here? You've got a lesbian in the office, tick. You've got a trans-identifying woman in the office, tick. You've got a woman office manager, tick. You've got a trans warehouse manager, tick. You've got a woman corporate manager, tick. So they just can't help themselves. They want to pretend, in one sense, like they are lampooning identity politics, but in actual fact, they're not really doing that at all. When you look at this, what they're really doing is lampooning the people who don't really go along with the identity politics. It's kind of weird the way this whole thing is put together, actually, and some of the changes, I guess they were trying to create a bit of a creative distinction or difference for their own version of The Office, but some of the changes just don't quite make sense. Like the new Dwight character, this woman who is now playing the character who really is supposed to be Dwight, the new Dwight in the Australian Office, she actually is the receptionist, and so it kind of, like, her power in the office, it doesn't actually make as much sense now. Like if you go back to the original UK Office, Gareth, he was a sales rep. In the American version, Dwight is a sales rep. And therefore, they would have a bit more mana, a bit more respect, a bit more power in that office. Sales reps generally tend to wield that kind of power. The office receptionist has a level of power and connection with the boss that doesn't quite make sense. And so I see why they've done it. They've tried to create a creative difference. And I also can't help but wonder if they did this because they've made the character of Pam, and also previously before Pam, it was Dawn in the UK version. They were both the office receptionists that the characters of Jim and Tim fall in love with. But in actual fact, they've shifted that around. That whole dynamic's changed now. And now the new Pam, she's also a sales rep. So I wonder if they couldn't sort of just bring themselves to do this. It was like the identity politics and the pull of the sort of the demonic force of identity politics. They just couldn't do it. They were like, no, she can't be subordinate to Jim, the new Jim, and no, she can't be merely a receptionist. She's got to be a sales rep. It's just, I don't know, I can't help but be suspicious about why they did that, but those sort of changes, they kind of don't quite make sense anymore, and some of the things that worked well in the previous iterations of The Office, especially when what you're watching is effectively one big, long, derivative act of plagiarism of much superior television series, like the American and the US version are much superior to this version. And so that doesn't really help when you've got all these other changes going on and the new version even isn't as good. And it's also been changed in ways that are kind of a little bit confusing. The one thing that I found really interesting and quite stark was the fact that the HR guy now is really the smartest and most capable one in the office. That is quite a radical shift from where we've been before. And I do have to wonder again, is this because, I don't know, the people who wrote this, they love that sort of managerial HR type class? I don't know. I mean, yeah, it's kind of interesting. Hannah Howard. She is basically just a recycled David Brent and Michael Scott. And there are moments, there are so many of these, in fact. It's just time after time you are watching and you go, oh, yeah, that's a plagiarism of David Brent. Oh, yeah, that's a direct plagiarism of a Michael Scott moment. Sometimes it's in the mannerism, sometimes it's in what's been written and put on screen. And David Brent and Michael Scott, they just did it far better. The thing is that the lady who's playing Hannah Howard, she's actually quite a competent actress in her own right. And I think perhaps if they'd given this thing a bit more scope, then maybe they could have created a different version of those previous characters. Like David Brent is a particular type of bad boss. Michael Scott is a particular type of bad boss, but Michael Scott is quite different from David Brent. And here was an opportunity to create Hannah Howard as a type of David Brent and a type of Michael Scott, but also quite different in her own way, and they didn't do that. It's just direct plagiarism, and the problem is every time that happens you go, I've already seen this before. There was one moment though that really stuck out to me and I was kind of a little bit surprised by. I wonder if they got themselves into a bit of a writing corner and they thought this was just the cheapest and quickest and easiest way to write them out of it. But at the end of what I think was episode 6, if my memory serves me correctly, Hannah Howard actually exploits one of her employees in a really awful way. Like there is a really expensive coffee bill that because of Hannah Howard's mistake, she has racked up for the office, and the office is supposed to pay the coffee bill for the warehouse guys, and I think it's about $800 or so. But she manipulates one of her more vulnerable employees and convinces him to actually pay the bill. And this is quite a toxic moment, and it really stuck out to me because even in their ineptitude and their foolishness and their bad behaviour and their mistreatment of their fellow employees, David Brent and Michael Scott, I can't really ever recall a moment like this. Instead, their problems tended to stem from egotism and their ineptitude. They were just hopeless, and they would often bumble through employee relations, and you know, they didn't treat their employees well because they didn't really know what they were doing, but they thought they did. They were arrogant and they were full of ego and they were just inept and they were basically like buffoons. But this wasn't a buffoonish thing to do. This was quite a toxic and exploitative thing to do to an employee. Quite awful, actually, when you think about it. And it really stuck out to me. It was so inconsistent with her character throughout the rest of the series, and it is totally inconsistent with the boss character in The Office in general. And it was just a small moment, but it really stuck out to me as one of those things where I was like, ugh, what happened here? And I think it was they got to the end of an episode maybe, and they thought, we don't know how to perhaps write this little particular problem, this little predicament she's in, out of the plot, so let's wrap this up as quickly as we can and we'll do it this way. But it wasn't great. It just wasn't great at all. Now, I don't think anyone watching this is going to be surprised to discover that there are multiple regurgitated plot lines that are lifted directly from the original UK and US versions. In fact, The Office even looks like the UK version of The Office, and there's this interesting thing going on with the theme music, the opening theme music, which kind of feels like it's a mashup, an awful, inferior mashup of the original British theme music and the American version. It sort of goes halfway between the both in a way that really speaks to, I think, the ultimate weakness and pointlessness of this series. It is just a regurgitated act of plagiarism of former TV series that were done far better. So the original UK version had its own unique character and attributes, and then the US version, when it starts, there is initially this type of plagiarism that's going on. They are lifting plot points directly from the UK episodes of The Office, but then what the US version does very wisely is it moves off in a different direction and it charts its own course. But what the Australian version of The Office is doing is that it's going back to the US and the UK versions, and it's just lifting wholesale plot points and characters and their mannerisms directly from what has gone before. That is different. Here was an opportunity for them to chart a slightly different course, but they don't really do that. They just go back, and time again you're going, oh no, don't do that. Don't just repeat that. It was already done in a far superior way. You repeating it is not helping you to actually produce great television. And one way this is really noticeable, I think, in this series is the Pam and Jim characters in the Australian Office. Their plot is just boring the third time around. The UK Office did it really well, and then the US version took it in some new and interesting directions. They didn't just replicate. But what we've got here is just a watered down rehashing of, as I said, formerly great television series in the UK and the US version of The Office. And this version of Pam and Jim, they're just plagiarizing moments from those other characters. And so you're watching this and you're going, not only have I seen this before, but this is two people who are not those other characters that I know, whether it's Tim and Dawn or Jim and Pam. They are just replicating moments from other people's lives, and it's just quite jarring. And it's not great. This is not great television. There was a way they could have done this, I think, whereby they didn't just rehash and produce a watered down and very bland looking act of plagiarism from formerly great television. They could have crafted something new, but they didn't. They've just gone back to, I guess, taking the easiest route possible. Here they are producing a product. And so what do? They replicate what the previous product looked like, and they're like, hey, here's more product for you to consume. The one thing I will say before I wrap this up, though, is that the UK and the US Office, those series, what they primarily did was they focused on lampooning office life and office culture. That's the primary target of their parody. But there are some differences here in the Australian one. There are moments where the Australian version does what I think Australian parody does really, really well. Whenever you see Australian parody TV shows, what they do well is they actually parody Australian culture. And there are moments when they do that in The Office. And if they probably did more of that, they might have actually ended up charting their own course. But as a result, this first season is just primarily acts of plagiarism and moments of lampooning Aussie culture. When you lampoon Aussie culture, you are doing something different to what the former versions, the UK and the US versions of The Office did, and also you're creating a point of difference that is interesting and new to an audience who might have already seen those previous iterations of The Office. You're doing something actually original, but they don't do as much of it as they probably need to really support and make this a strong first season of this new version of The Office. Which brings me to my concluding thoughts, and my concluding thoughts are about the concluding episode of season 1 of The Office, and it was just extremely painful to watch that final episode and the ending of that final episode, because they have wholesale plagiarized an already done to death plot point in The Office, and that is the boss who pretends that they have saved their employees and their branch, when in actual fact they haven't, but they take credit for it. And obviously someone who's smart enough in the office figures out that the boss is lying. And so they've told their employees, I've sacrificed myself, or I've done a good thing to save you, but in actual fact it wasn't them at all who did any of the saving. Corporate decisions were made which saved the branch, and the boss is just taking credit for it. We've already seen this in The Office, and it was so painful to see it again, and more so that this was where they chose to end the series, on an act of plagiarism. At least be bold, take a risk, end on an act that isn't plagiarism, end on an act where you do something maybe original or new, but no, they couldn't do that. They just go back to this tired old plot point and they rehash it. And what made this, I think, even worse, and this mars the whole season, is you're watching this series and you're kind of thinking to yourself, hold on, how does the central plot conceit actually make much sense? So they've been told that they should work from home, but then corporate has suddenly and on the fly allowed them to actually all come back into the office. And the reason they have allowed them to do that is because the boss has promised this absurd moment of economic gain for the company. If you let us come back into the office, I'll make $300,000 in profit in a month, which is just impossible. They wouldn't have been able to do that, and everyone in corporate would have known that. And so they agree to this harebrained scheme. But then you're thinking to yourself, well, why are they all at home anyway? We know now that there tends to be more productivity if people are actually in the office and working together, especially in a situation like this one where they really do need to all be together. And so it kind of doesn't quite make sense. And I don't think it will hold up either. Like, if you go back and watch the very original version of the UK Office and the American Office, it still holds up today. There are moments that might have a particular time-bound historical cultural relevance that perhaps over time get a little bit lost, but the general heart of the story in the series, it's universal. It speaks to anybody at any time. But when you tie the central conceit of your plot to a COVID-related workplace phenomena, people working from home, this series is pretty quickly going to run out of steam. People in 10 years and 15, 20 years who go back and watch this will kind of be scratching their heads wondering exactly what they're referring to and why this makes any sense at all, which brings me to my final thoughts. Who is this even for? Like, if you've seen The Office UK and you've seen The Office US and you loved those, you're probably not going to enjoy this. You're just going to find yourself frustrated, and you're going to find yourself being reminded of far greater moments in far greater previous versions of The Office. If it's not that, you're going to find yourself frustrated and annoyed that all you are seeing is just blatant acts of plagiarism over and over again in a very unoriginal way being played out in front of you. So it's not really for people who are already lovers of The Office. Maybe diehard nerds who just want to say, well, I love The Office so much that I'll watch everything they put out. I've watched all the deleted scenes and all the specials and everything they didn't broadcast. I watched all of it. I even watched the David Brent movies. That's how dedicated of a fan that I am. Maybe that little niche market might really, really love this. But the only people I can see who will watch this and go, oh, this is actually quite funny, are people who have never seen The Office before. So they've never encountered this before. But if that's who they're aiming for, it doesn't really feel like they've marketed to that demographic at all. It doesn't feel like they're trying to bring a new demographic in at all. In fact, if you look at the character and the structure of the characters, the nature of the characters in this new Australian Office, they're not really trying to speak to a younger generation. They are speaking clearly to the older fans of the previous series, whether it's the US or the UK version or both, but then all they do is they just rip off those previous versions. So I think this thing is dead on arrival, unless they figure out a way, like the US version of The Office did, to actually start writing a new and original trajectory for these characters, and they bring in a bit more lampooning of the Australian culture, which I think could be something that would be a real strength for this series. Then this is dead on arrival. It's not going to go any further. It is another failed dalliance on the part of Amazon that's not really going to have much of a future. Thanks for tuning in. Don't forget to give the video a like, and also if you're not already a subscriber, please subscribe to the channel. All of that really, really helps the content creation that we're engaged in here. And don't forget, if you want to become a patron and support our work, you can do that at patreon.com/leftfootmedia. The link is in today's show notes. You can contribute any amount that you want to help support the creation of these videos. A huge thank you to all of our patrons. It's thanks to you that this episode was made possible. In the meantime, don't forget, live by goodness, truth and beauty, not by lies. And I'll see you next time on Left Foot Media.